Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Michael Greeley. I teach English literature at Lancaster University, and what I have for you today is a talk on postmodernism and contemporary literature. What this talk is going to do is to define postmodernism and to introduce you to some key postmodernist techniques. And along the way, there's going to be some interactive elements. So there'll be some moments where I invite you to pause the recording, to have a think, to have a chat if you're with other people, or to jot down some notes or jot down some ideas. Okay, so what is postmodernism? This is a term that refers to a style of art and culture that appeared in the aftermath of the modernist movement. So the modernist movement runs from roughly 1890 to 1940. So postmodernism is a kind of umbrella term for styles of art and culture broadly in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's a term that can be applied to literature, but also to architecture, to painting, cinema, television and music. And it's worth knowing that postmodernism is a controversial term, and it's controversial in at least two ways. People don't always agree on precisely what it means, and people can't agree on whether it is a good thing or a bad thing. And my hope is that by the end of this talk, you all have a clearer sense of what I think it means, whether postmodernism is a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, that's for you to decide. So Postmodernism, to break it down, postmodernism implies that we're dealing with something that comes in the aftermath of modernism. So this begs the question, what was modernism? It's a term we use to describe the work of a generation of experimental writers and artists of the late 19th and early 20th century. In literature, it's associated with people like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, and Joseph Conrad. And some of the characteristics of modernist writing were complexity, fragmentation, and aggressive innovation. To flesh out some of those generalizations a bit and to introduce you to modernist culture, I thought it would be helpful just to take a very quick look at the visual arts. So I want you to take a quick look at an example of what I'm going to call traditional art. This is a painting from 1762. And here is an example of modernist art. So this is a painting from 1913, so right slap bang in the modernist period. Let's put them together. And what I'm going to invite you to do now is pick a favourite. Think of which one of these you prefer. Think of which one of these you'd like to hang on your wall. You might want to pause the recording at this moment and just think about that and think about which you prefer and why you prefer it. Okay, so clearly this is a question of taste. There's no right and wrong answer to the question, which of these should you prefer? But I suppose one obvious point perhaps that I'd like to underline about the contrast between these two paintings is whether you prefer the traditional painting or whether you prefer the modernist painting. The most obvious contrast between the two is that it is very obvious what the traditional painting is about. It's a picture of a horse. The modernist painting is a picture of, well, of what exactly? It's abstract, it's fragmented, it's experimental. It might look great on your wall. You might like that kind of almost, not quite a jigsaw puzzle feel, but almost a kind of random, dynamic, abstract feel that it has to it. So that's something, as I say, you might like to hang on your wall. Can you imagine reading a book that had some of those seemingly random, abstract, scattered qualities to it? Because this is what the most experimental modernist writers were trying to achieve. So here is an example of modernist writing. This is just an excerpt from the first page of James Joyce's monumental experimental novel, Finnegan's Wake. I'm not going to read this out to you, and it will become clear why as you cast your eyes over these words. So just take a moment, perhaps to pause the recording and just to read this excerpt to yourself. Okay, so when you look at this quotation, what do you see? Some of the terms that I would use to describe Joyce's writing, one is cryptic. It's not immediately clear what he's writing about. There is a kind of an affinity, I think, with nonsense poetry, with the poetry of someone like Edward Lear, where you get this strange kind of style, which almost is semi-intelligible and semi-unintelligible, almost like a picture that comes in and out of focus. And Joyce's style is often described as a stream of consciousness style. So stream of consciousness is a kind of uninterrupted tumble of thoughts as they come out almost unedited from the mind onto the page. So you get something that is cryptic, that is semi-nonsensical, and that is stream of consciousness. And what you get is something that is extraordinarily experimental and a real challenge to read. So can you imagine, here's a talking point, can you imagine now, having seen a sample of Finnegan's Wake, of thinking, yeah, I'd like to sit down and read several hundred pages of that style? Do you find it intriguing and compelling, or do you find it off-putting? Again, that's something to pause over and to think about. Now, whenever you think about that, what I'm calling a hyper experimental style associated with people like Joyce, associated with the modernist movement, which kind of staked everything on being abstract and innovative and new and different and unexperimental. Whether you love it and you're inspired by it, or whether you find it off-putting, what it did was it raised a really difficult question for the next generation of writers who came up in the aftermath of modernism, which is how on earth do you follow that? So I'm going to call this the postmodern dilemma. This is the dilemma broadly for writers working and artists working in the post-Second World War period. And the dilemma, or the question, is this: where can art go after the extreme experiments of modernism? On the one hand, we can't simply pretend modernism never happened. We can't maybe ignore it and just go back to the old-fashioned ways of doing things. So think of that picture of the guy with the horse. Could we go back to producing paintings like that? It would seem very, very retrograde, potentially. At the same time, how do you compete with, or how do you surpass the absolute novelty of modernist art? How can you be more experimental than James Joyce? He seems to have almost set a kind of limit, an unsurpassable limit, for absolutely crazy, innovative, experimental writing that is impossible to exceed. So this is what postmodern artists in different ways are grappling with, the postmodern dilemma. And when I talk you through, as I'm about to do, some key postmodernist techniques, in different ways they are a solution to that dilemma of what happens next. Where does art go next after the modernist moment? So I'm going to talk about the nostalgia mode, intertextuality, metafiction, and the death of the real as key techniques and preoccupations in postmodernist art. Let's start with the nostalgia mode. I'm going to introduce this using an example. I want to imagine you're a film director and you want to make a film and you think, I want to do something new, but I'm going to draw on the films that inspire me, and I'm inspired by, and I love samurai movies. But also one aspect of culture I love is myth and fairy tale, Rapunzel in the Tower, that kind of storytelling. And I love westerns, gunslingers. I'm really big on westerns. So what can I do with those? We could take maybe the samurai and give him a lightsaber, and I could call him a Jedi Knight. And I could take the trope of the princess in the tower, and I could maybe update that a bit, and I could have a princess in a space station. And I could take the gunslinger with his black waistcoat, that trademark look, and I could give him a kind of laser blaster, and I could call him Han Solo. And I put those together, and there you have it. I have created Star Wars. So this is, in a way, me looking into the way George Lucas's imagination worked, the director, the creator of Star Wars. Star Wars was a revolutionary, spectacular science fiction film, big on special effects, one of the first great modern blockbusters. So it was something absolutely new. But as you peel beneath the surface of Star Wars, what you get is actually something that is a bit of a nostalgia trip. It's going back to the samurai movies, it's going back to cowboy movies, and it's going back even further to myth and fairy tale. So this is one of the curious things about postmodernism, is it sort of goes forward and backwards at the same time. It wants to do something new, but it does so with a kind of Back to the Future nostalgia quality to it. So the nostalgia mode, it isn't about wanting to live in the past. It isn't wanting to live in the good old days. It's more about wanting to bring back the good old styles. And it's something you can see in fashion. So at the moment, I think there's a bit of a 90s revival in fashion at the moment. And fashion is always reviving. It's always going back, excuse me, to earlier decades for inspiration. It's something you can see in television. So some of the popular TV shows at the moment, like Stranger Things or Cobra Kai, are revivals of 1980s TV shows and 1980s film franchises, or just 1980s styles. They're very kind of steeped in 1980s nostalgia. It's there in literature as well. So a famous example would be what is known as a neo-Victorian text. So a neo-Victorian text is a modern novel written in a Victorian style. There are many examples, and one of the pioneering ones is a novel by John Fowles called The French Lieutenant's Woman. It's a novel that was published in the 1960s, but it's written in the style of a novel from the 1860s. So again, it's very much a back to the future or a nostalgic approach to originality and novelty. So this brings me to my next talking point, or my next thinking point, my point for discussion. How much importance do you attach to novelty and originality in art? Is it okay for writers to tell the same old stories, you know, back to Rapunzel, back to the story of the Seven Samurai, let's tell that again, or back to the story of the cowboy and the gunslinger, let's tell that again. So is it okay for writers to tell the same stories over and over again? Or should we always insist on novelty? Should we always demand from art something fresh and something new? So there we have a talking point. You might want to pause and think about that. Okay, the next postmodernist technique that I want to describe in some detail is the technique known as intertextuality. So intertextuality is the presence of part of one literary text in another literary text. Excuse me. This could be a direct quotation, it could be an indirect reference, or a shared character or storyline. So for example, the title of Ken Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that's an example of intertextuality because the phrase "one flew over the cuckoo's nest" is a quotation from a children's rhyme. So that point where two texts overlap, the children's rhyme and Kesey's novel, it's a point of intertextual connection or intertextual overlap. In a play like Top Girls by Carol Churchill, one of her characters is called Griselda. That's a point of intertextual overlap because Griselda is a character borrowed from Chaucer's Clerk's Tale in the Canterbury Tales. Or if you think of the poetry of Carol Ann Duffy, just to give you one more example of intertextuality, her poem Sub is one that quotes famous sayings from 20th century culture, while her poem The Laughter of Stafford Girls High quotes Shakespeare and William Blake. So in all sorts of ways, once you start looking for it, intertextuality is quite a pervasive phenomenon in modern contemporary and postmodern writing. But why is it there? Why is it so prevalent? So this is a talking point. Why would an author decide to quote the words of another author or the words of another literary text? There are, I think, a great many reasons why someone might choose to do that. So I'm going to invite you to pause the recording and write down as many possible answers to this question as you can think of. Okay, so when I was thinking about this question, I came up with various answers. This list isn't definitive, it isn't exhaustive, but it can give you a sense of the motives for or the reasons for intertextuality in literature. So why would you quote someone? Why would you quote another writer? It could be a way of paying tribute. If someone has put something more eloquently than you believe you could, then you pay tribute to them by quoting their words. It can be a form of exhibitionism, that quoting someone is a way of flaunting your knowledge. Aren't I clever? I can quote Aristotle or Dante or Shakespeare. It can be a way of showing off. Quoting can be a kind of screen or mask. If you are reluctant to say something open and definitive about maybe a delicate issue, perhaps you can take refuge behind someone else's words. You can quote people for purposes of mockery or parody. Sometimes the most devastating way of teasing someone is just to quote something that they've said to them back to them. And quotation can be a way of making a point about originality. It can suggest that perhaps there's nothing left to be said. There's nothing new to be said, that all we can do is recycle and restate and quote what's already been said. And that's something that's very characteristic of postmodernist culture, is the suspicion that the best we can do is recycle what's already been said, rather than get hung up on the idea that there are absolutely new, unprecedented stories to be told. Finally, quotation, intertextuality can be a way of making a point about universality, that if you've had a feeling or a sentiment or an emotion or an experience that is there in Jane Austen or Shakespeare or Dante or wherever, you can use that quotation to suggest that there's something universal about this experience. It's not just unique to me or to this moment, but something that is sort of happens across time, and that perhaps everyone can see themselves in. So I want to give you an example of intertextuality in action in slightly more detail, and my example is Tom Stoppard's play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. So this is a play that takes its title and its main characters and its storyline from Shakespeare's Hamlet. So that line, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, it's a line from Hamlet. It's a line from the most famous play ever written, arguably the most famous work of literature ever written. But it's a play, Stoppard's play, what it does is it reimagines the events of Hamlet as seen from the point of view of two of its most marginal and forgettable characters. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are very kind of peripheral and secondary characters in the play, and they're almost interchangeable. You don't get much of a sense of any difference between them. So there they are on the edges of the play, and they die, and they're kind of, as I say, they're quite marginal and they're quite forgettable. But Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as a play, it centres on them. So it re-centres on what was marginal and what was almost forgotten. So intertextuality in the context of Stoppard's play is thus an ingenious solution to the question of originality. Stoppard's play suggests that we can do something new with Hamlet, something which is almost over familiar as a text. We can do something new with it, not by abandoning the past, but by revisiting it with fresh eyes. So not only has Stoppard created something new, he's also renewed our appreciation of Hamlet by enabling us to see the play just from such an unexpected perspective. Okay, the next key postmodernist technique that I want to talk about is metafiction. And metafiction is a concept that I'm going to introduce once again via the visual arts. So once again, I have two paintings for you. The first you'll all recognise is probably the most famous painting in art history, which is Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. And here we have another painting, also called Mona Lisa, this time by Andy Warhol, and he produces this in 1963. So Mona Lisa number one, Mona Lisa number two. What's the difference? I suppose the difference is the original Mona Lisa is a painting of a woman, whereas Andy Warhol's Mona Lisa is a painting of a woman. So Leonardo da Vinci in his painting is trying to represent a human being, is trying to represent reality, whereas Warhol is trying to represent a representation of reality. So there is that, in a way, that sense of layers of representation, that Warhol isn't giving us a window onto the world or a window onto reality, but using art to represent art. And this is something that is very prevalent in postmodernist art, is the representation of representation. And a particular form that it often takes in literature is the form of what is called metafiction. So a metafictional work is a work of metafiction is a work of fiction that is about books. It's a book about books rather than a book about life. Here are some examples. So there's a novel by Muriel Spark called The Comforters. And this is a novel in which the heroine is a young woman called Caroline Rose. She's been bothered, as she goes about her daily business, she's been bothered by a persistent tapping sound in the background. In time, she realises that what she's hearing is the sound of the typewriter keys on which this novel is being written. So Caroline Rose is a character in a novel who realises that she is a character in a novel. So The Comforters is a novel about life and human relationships, but also it's a novel about novels. It's fiction about fiction. So one of the earliest examples known to me of postmodernist metafiction. Another example is a novel by Martin Amis called Money. So in this novel, the hero of the novel is called John Self. He goes to the pub, and who should he bump into in the pub but Martin Amis himself? So Martin Amis is both the author of the novel and a character in the novel. So John Self and Martin Amis in this novel, they strike up an uneasy friendship, but Self remains somewhat suspicious of Amis. So both of these novels really raise a question of paranoia, the sense of suddenly realising that you're part of a fiction, that you're being created and you're being manipulated. And that paranoia about your own reality, I think, is something that is quite a common experience in postmodernist writing. And also the way these novels are books about books, fiction about fiction, it's almost as though it's reading a postmodernist book is like looking at a snake eating its own tail. There's something, and critics of postmodernism would say that it's almost like navel gazing, that the idea of fiction should surely be to go out and confront the real world rather than to gaze at itself in this kind of inward-looking way. But for me, I think metafiction is always intellectually intriguing. And I think the questions it raises about identity, about what is and isn't real, about who tells the story of your life. Do you get the choice to map it out yourself, or is that story being sort of scripted for you by higher powers? These, I think, are really fascinating questions that metafiction explores. So I've mentioned that sense of paranoia, that real kind of almost systematic suspicion of the world around you as something that can be very prevalent in postmodern writing. And this brings me to my final key technique, which I want to talk about, which is the idea of the death of the real. And I'm going to illustrate this using movies rather than literature. One of the recurring themes of postmodernist culture is the suspicion that reality isn't real. It isn't as substantial, permanent, and authentic as we believed. And there are various examples of modern cinema which often have a kind of quite a science fiction flavour to them, which deal with someone who cottons onto the fact that the world around them isn't as real as they thought it might be. So The Truman Show, starring Jim Carrey, is about a guy who one fine day realises that his entire life is being broadcast to a worldwide audience of millions. He's the star of his own reality TV show. So the life he thought was real is actually being manufactured by the media. And The Matrix, very well-known science fiction trilogy, in which people begin to cotton onto the fact that what they thought was reality is actually a kind of high-tech illusion. And then Christopher Nolan's film Inception, about people increasingly unable to differentiate with any confidence between what is hard, concrete reality and what is a kind of dream or a delusion. So this is that moment where you can't differentiate between that which is substantial and authentic and that which is synthetic or manufactured or illusory. That moment is known as the death of the real, and it's a moment that you get over and over again in postmodernist culture. What are the implications of the notion that reality isn't real? How should we react to this news? One way of reacting to it would be to say, well, we need to escape from illusions. It's time to wake up to the real reality. It's a crisis that absolutely needs an urgent solution. So that would be one way of sort of reacting to reports of the death of the real. Another way would be to say, well, maybe we shouldn't get too hung up on the idea of authenticity and realness. After all, how do you measure realness? And this, I think, is particularly relevant to debates about things like food or music. So, for example, people will occasionally say, I don't like that music, it's manufactured, it's synthetic. And when people say that, the implication is that there's some kind of music which is natural, that just somehow it grew on a tree or it emerged from the soil in this kind of organic way. All music is manufactured. All music is constructed and created by performers using musical instruments. So when you think about music, what you've not got is real music and unreal music, but maybe different kinds of unreality. So maybe, and there's a certain school of thought in postmodernism which is quite laid back about the idea of the death of the real, and says that, you know, we shouldn't obsess about authenticity. So I've given you two very contradictory answers to this question. What do I think? Well, I think I'm going to leave this as a kind of cliffhanger, because I'm sure you will have opinions of your own about the death of the real and about postmodernist techniques and postmodernist culture in general. Okay, so thank you for listening. I hope that was a useful, quick whistle-stop tour of postmodernist culture. If you want to know more about what it is to study English literature at university, we're always delighted when people get in touch. So do please check us out. Do please visit our website and get in touch with us. And I have the web address, and we have our department email address for you there as well. So thanks very much. Thank you for listening.